Yeah, I'm very pleased to have you all here, and I'm also very pleased to have Mauricio Delgado with us, who's a professor of psychology and department chair at Rutgers University in New York. Mauricio is also the associate director of the Rutgers University Brain Imaging Center and affiliated with the Center for Molecular and Behavioral Neuroscience. He's received his PhD in 2002 with Jane Fees, and continued to complete a postdoc with Elizabeth Phelps at NYU. And he's received various rewards, including the Presidential Early Career Award. And also just last year, he was awarded with the Distinguished Scholar Award from the Society for Social and Effective Science. Mauricio has written a lot of articles, scientific articles on various topics, including reward processing. He's doing research on social interaction, as he's just told us a few minutes ago. Also including work on addiction, and has published in various high-ranking journals, including Nature Neuroscience, Nature Communications, or Neuron. And yeah, today he'll speak about the subjective value of perceived control, and I'm very looking forward to it. Thank you for being here.
All right. Well, thank you, David, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Perfect. Yep.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today and talk to you a little bit about our research on the subjective value of perceived control. And it was particularly fun for me because this is work that I haven't put together too much in a talk. So this was great to kind of try to integrate it. And let's see. Okay. So I wanted to start by telling you that what we already know, that on a day-to-day basis, we're faced with various decisions, from difficult to choosing a course of study or career path, to mundane or easy, such as what to have for lunch. Depending on the overall goal, these decisions involve choices that we hope are going to lead to desired outcomes or positive outcomes. Take the example of traffic here, where the desired outcome is to get to the destination as soon as possible. Now, in this situation, you have a choice. You can stay in the clogged highway, which would cost about an extra 20 minutes or half an hour, or you can take the approach and exit right over there, take your chance, and hopefully get home a little faster. So let's say you decide to make a choice and take the exit, and then when you do get home, you get that reward signal, you get a positive outcome, and that tends to reinforce the choice that you just made. But I want to point out that it also reinforces something else. That is, that positive outcome of making that choice also reinforces your perception of control. That is, the increase in belief in your ability to exert control over the environment in order to produce the desired results. And to highlight the importance of this perception of control, the value of this perception of control, imagine in a few weeks later, you're back in the same situation. You're stuck on that same traffic, and you're approaching that same exit. But this time, you're stuck on the bus, and you can't really influence the driver's choices. So this lack of control tends to be quite aversive. And is this ability to make a choice, this opportunity to exert control over the environment, that I'm going to argue that is valuable in of itself. So we know that the opportunity to choose can elicit an increased perception of personal control, and that perception of control can enhance positive affect and buffer negative emotional responses to aversive events. We know that the removal of control is aversive, and that struggles with personal control are at the core of anxiety and mood disorders. So as such, the belief in personal control is something that's highly adaptive, because its presence and absence can have a significant impact on how we regulate our emotions, general well-being, and the likelihood of making positive behavioral changes. We know from a lot of very good research that's been done, especially there at Lübeck University with David, that strong associations between subjective value of control exist with how we feel, the positive affect, and neurocircuitry involved in reward processing. So what I would like to focus on today is I highlight some of these areas of the brain that are involved in reward processing, such as striatum and ventral cortex, and how they integrate these signals that are affective, motivational, and protective to oversee this value of control. So here's an outline of the talk today. I'm going to start with some earlier work that we've done in the lab, highlighting the opportunity for choice and how that's desirable and tends to recruit these neurosystems of reward. We'll talk about then the subjective value of perceived control and how this preference for exercising control tends to also be tracked by neurosystems involved in reward processing that tend to scale with subjective value of stimuli and actions. And then we'll conclude the talk by talking about how perceived control can also help cope with negative affect. So starting from the beginning, when we're considering these options and thinking about this idea of choice, we wanted to highlight this idea that it was desirable. So we went back to some paradigms that existed early on that were very influential for us in terms of thinking about rewards. Here I highlight the idea that presenting a condition Q, such as the circle, either a primary or secondary reinforcer, work done by Brian Knudsen and John Doherty early on, for example, shown that activity to the presentation of the Q would elicit activity in the striatum. So we borrowed from some of these paradigms and we took a Q and we said, well, imagine the Q is going to predict a potential reward, but instead of predicting a potential reward, the Q is going to predict a potential choice between two stimuli. So this was work done by Lauren Liotti, who looked at this idea of the opportunity for choice being desirable. She came up with this paradigm where you actually had to pick a key between these two choices, a blue key or a yellow key, and they would yield a reward that would vary. The reward probabilities were equal across the key. But in a paradigm, one thing that stood out is that that choice was preceded by a cue. So if the participant saw a circle, it predicted they would have a choice. If participants saw a diamond, it predicted they'd have no choice. That is, the computer would pick for them either the blue or the yellow key. Importantly, the blue or yellow key both have the same probability of receiving a reward. So in a typical trial, you would see the cue. The cue would predict choice or no choice, and then you would receive the reward. Notably, participants enjoyed playing this game much more, and they liked the cue that predicted when they would have a choice compared to when they would have no choice. And the simple ROI analysis, we basically took Brian Knudsen's ROI from the ventral striatum that was looked at in terms of anticipating a potential reward. And we looked at what that activity would be if they were anticipating just having choice. And what we observed is that the cue that predicted having choice elicited greater activity here in the ventral striatum, suggesting this link about reward, positive affect, and this value of choice. A collaborator at the University of Edinburgh, Liana Romaniuk, she decided that she wanted to also look at this idea when thinking about the importance of value of control and how important for the core of how important it was for depressive etiology. So she looked at the paradigm with participants that had depressive symptoms that were assessed by this quick inventory of depressive symptomatology scale. And we know from patients with depression that they suffer from anhedonia. They show diminished activity in the striatum to rewards. And work from Lubeck again, that shows that the participants with depression also tend to show maladaptive self-belief formation and issues of the feedback processing systems. So what Liana here did is when she did that same task that I just described to you, she noticed that participants who were activating the striatum to cues, the greater the depressive symptoms, the less they engage the striatum to the idea of choice. That is, striatum responses to cues indicating opportunity for choice tend to be diminished as a function of greater subclinical depression symptoms. So with this idea of choice being valuable came the counter thoughts that we know that choice is not always desirable, right? So I think of sometimes it's been a long work day. I get home. My wife has had a long work day. Look at each other. Nobody wants to do anything for dinner. And we say, well, let's just not cook. Let's just order out. What do you want? I look at her and she says to me, I don't care. You pick. I'm sure everybody has had that experience. Sometimes choice is not desirable, right? Because there's too many choices. We're fatigued, limited cognitive resources. There's maybe perceived risk or uncertainty, lack of expertise. or even fear of making the wrong decision, such as who wants to order something for dinner and be incorrect, right? Any of all these reasons tends to lead to a status quo bias, which is a preference to accept the default rather than to make a choice. But I like to argue that the opportunity for choice, the opportunity to exert the control over the environment, tends to be desirable regardless of this valence, if it's negative or positive. That is, let's take the same example. As soon as my wife says to me, I don't care, you pick what to order, I make a suggestion such as, how about we just get a pizza? And then she looks at me and she says, no way. Okay, so she doesn't want control, she doesn't want to make a choice, but she wants to maintain the veto power, right? And so we still maintain that opportunity for control. And it's just, we have chosen to give up that, or to pass on that expertise. So what Lauren decided to do next is use that same paradigm that I just described to you. And this time you have the keys that try to win as much money as possible again, but every now and then there's a cue that predicts a loss trial, where you pick a key and try to lose as little money as possible, with the context here being of putting participants in this gain or this loss domain. So we observed a replication of the first study, which is participants liked having choice. One is in the gain domain, more so than no choice. But when it was in this monetary losses context, we actually didn't find a difference, surprisingly. They didn't like the losses trials, and also there was no difference between choice and no choice. When we looked at the striatal response, again, we replicated the monetary gains condition, where we saw greater striatal activity to the choice versus the no choice condition, but that wasn't significant in the losses condition. So that led us to explore this data a little bit further. And what we decided to do is we realized that there were some participants who actually really liked the task and others that were a little more taken back by the task and they weren't as involved. So we did an individual difference analysis and we focused on the monetary losses specifically. And what we observed is that participants who reported and who liked choice more so than not having choice. If we broke that up, we observed that in the striatum, the participants who preferred choice actually did show that differential striatal response in the losses condition, while those that actually preferred having no choice, just defaulting, they're the ones that showed no difference. Highlighting to us this idea that we do have to think a little bit more about individual differences in this preferences for control. All right. So for the first part of the talk, what I hope I was able to show you is that the anticipation of choice opportunity is desirable and associated with increased neuroactivity in reward-related circuitry. This activity is decreased in participants with subclinical depression, but the effect is susceptible to individual differences in the perception of control and can be context dependent, for example, when faced with losses. So from our first set of studies, we also observed this importance of understanding how participants subjectively valued having control. So one of the next set of studies that we try to do is actually try to understand that a little bit better. And one of the examples I want to highlight to you here that students shared with me that I thought was very useful is thinking about perhaps your next trip and where you're going. You pick your destination, you're booking your plane tickets, and then when it comes time to the seating, you can choose to just let the computer select for you. But if you're like most people, you might want to self-select yourself. So you avoid the middle seat, pick the window or the aisle, or whatever. However, often when you have to pick that seat, you have to pay a little bit extra. And the idea is, are you willing to maintain control about your situation, even though it comes at a cost sometimes? And this is how Sally Wang, who led the series of studies, wanted to study this value of control. She wanted to basically see when participants had to make a choice between keeping basically selecting a option where they make the choice themselves versus defaulting to the computer, what would they choose? But importantly, she varied the task so that it came at a cost. That is, in this case here that I'm showing you, participants would have to give up about 2 points, which eventually we translated the points to monetary rewards. But they would be given up rewards in order to maintain control. So the goal here was to measure an individual subjective value attributed to exerting control. And participants were faced with a series of binary choices where the value of maintaining control versus relinquishing control would vary from 0 to 20 points. And before they even did this experiment where they had to make these choices, we actually had a training part where they were first exposed to the self-trials and computer trials alone, so they could experience the equal probability of success. So that wasn't something that was going to actually bias their decisions. Okay, so the task looked a little bit like this. These trials I'm going to call mixed because they include an option between the self and the computer. So it's mixed types of trials. And they had to pick which one do they want. Do they want to keep control, pick the self, or do they want to relinquish the control to the computer? And what they were actually relinquishing control to is a chance to win money. That is, if they picked self, and then they would play this card guessing game where they'd see a card had a question mark. You had to guess if the value of the card was higher or lower than 5. If you pick high or you pick low, then you'd get a reward. Either you'd get the points or you lose points. Now, alternative, if you had picked computer, that is, if you let the computer pick for you, you still had to make a motor response at this time, but it's just your action did not impact the outcome. The baseline condition, we had a comparison here, which is a baseline condition where either participants had a run where all the trials were self or all the trials were computer. So your choice wasn't really between self or computer. They were about the expected value of the reward, right? We call this the controllable one or the uncontrollable run. So one of the first questions we asked was about the neural correlates that would subserve the opportunity for control. A bit of a replication over the first studies that I showed you before. So we looked at the baseline comparisons, the self baseline, which is the controllable run, versus the computer baseline, which is the uncontrollable run. And what we observed, I'm going to highlight here, activity of the ventral striatum, consistent with this idea of the opportunity for choice, and having this idea of control is important and valuable. And we see here in this correlation, the parameter estimates for the ventral striatum. And on the x-axis, you see the locus of control scale, showing that the greater locus of control internally, the greater belief in yourself, the more you activate these reward-related regions, such as the striatum. Now, the second thing we looked in this task is this idea of whether participants would show a preference for exerting control, which would be picking the self option, regardless of the amount of money that they would be getting. And participants tend to choose the self option much more than the computer option in this kind of condition. But we wanted to also measure this preference for the self option. And I want to illustrate here hypothetically what we would think if participants were choosing solely based on the expected value of the option. On the y-axis, you see the expected proportion of the self choices versus the x-axis, the computer minus self EV difference. This is what it would look like. This is if you picked particularly based on EV. And we would have a point of equivalence of 0. The point of equivalence is where participants are equally likely to choose self or computer option. This is what our baseline condition looked like. So this is, again, when participants were just selecting based on EV, right? And our expected value here is basically 0, 0.16. So the question is, what happens in the mixed condition when participants are picking based on, do they show a bias towards the self option, or do they basically rely on the EV? And what we see is that people tend to bias and choose the self option more, even though it's coming at a cost, at about a point of equivalence of 3, which makes about 30% more picking. They pick choice, they pick self about 30% more than 0. When we use this POE as an individual measure in a participant level covariate, and we do a contrast in the mixed, what we find is that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is an area responsible for tracking these participants' subjective value of control. Highlighting, which is important given that this area has also been important in tracking subjective value in other domains in terms of reward. So more recently, one way that we have followed this up was work done by Yun Yang, where she kind of considered the idea that maybe there's different components of control that we really have to pay attention to. One of them is self-efficacy, which is the belief in one's capabilities to execute the behavior. So in the case of this task, maybe you're picking the self because there's this belief that if you pick, you're going to make sure that the desired outcome is going to happen. But there's also response efficacy, which in this case would be the belief that maybe certain behaviors are going to lead to the desired outcome. That is, the behavior itself, because of the probability that the higher value or such, is the one that's going to lead to the reward. These two elements tend to sometimes be integrated in the task, and it's harder to tell them apart. And what Yan Yan wanted to do is try to disintegrate, try to basically compare them a little better in a paradigm. So what she designed is a paradigm where you could kind of focus on self-efficacy a little bit more. And the way she did that is by saying, well, try to pick, there's a moving bar, and you would have to press a button and try to hit it as it gets closer to the target, right? And this target would vary in terms of thickness at 3 levels. And this would then allow you to measure self-efficacy at a level of three domains. Similarly, for response efficacy, the way that she tried to measure this is by then changing the probability of the potential reward. And again, 3 ways: 20%, 50%, and 80%. So participants would see a trial like this, where they would have to press the target to gain the reward. But importantly, the reward is contingent on not only making sure that you actually perform the behavior correctly, which would lead to self-efficacy, but then on the response efficacy, or the turning the card over so you get a reward. So you need both self-efficacy and response efficacy to achieve a reward. So one of the first things that Yan looked at in this paradigm was she had a rating task where participants saw that trial that I just showed you with both response efficacy and self-efficacy, but they were asked to focus on one particular attribute. So the question over there would be something like, how confident are you in your ability to hit the target in the game, which would be a measure of self-efficacy. Or the question would be, how confident are you that the card will lead to a win in the game, which again would be an evaluation of the response efficacy. And behaviorally, our confidence ratings kind of show a manipulation check of sorts, where participants showed an increase in self-efficacy according to the low, mid, and high conditions. Same with response efficacy, as you might expect. Neurally, what we are interested in is whether the neural responses related to self-efficacy would be associated with subjective value of control, and neural responses related to response efficacy would be directly associated with more of a reward response, kind of like the striatum, right? And we did an ROI analysis, univariate analysis, and we're able to see that indeed the striatum seemed to show a greater response when focusing on this response efficacy, while the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, there was a trend showing a response that was greater when participants were kind of tracking the idea of self-efficacy. A second thing that then Yan looked at a little bit more was what happens when then participants have to integrate both self-efficacy and response efficacy. That is, when you have to consider both of them at the same time to make a decision. So in this type of trial, they would see the card, they would see the bar, and they'd have to decide, do you want to play this game or not, right? There were 4 levels of the decision. You can play yes or very much so, and no, definitely not. And what we see here again, as a bit of a manipulation check, you can see that different levels of RE and response efficacy and different levels of self-efficacy, participants were responsive and they wanted to play when there were higher levels of success in perceived self-efficacy and perceived response efficacy, for example. When we looked at this stimulus presentation period, when they're making a decision whether they want to, thinking about whether they want to do or not, and they're evaluating the integrating the both response efficacy and self-efficacy, what we would see is with the MVPA approach, looking at yes versus no decisions, that areas such as the ventral medial cortex and the ventral striatum are integrated at this point, as you are kind of integrating both self-efficacy and response efficacy in order to calculate your decision. All right. So for the second part, what I hope I was able to show you is that participants were able to show a behavioral preference for having control that was captured via a willingness to pay type of measure. The subjective value of control was tracked in the ventral medial frontal cortex, the region implicated as representing the value of distinctive stimuli and options, so certainly representing a common currency, and that the integration of different components of perceived control, such as self-efficacy and response efficacy, these computations tend to involve cortico-striatal circuitry that help guide decision-making. All right, so now for the last part of the talk, I want to turn to the idea of being able to cope with negative affect by having or perceiving control in the environment. So one of the examples I like to use here is this idea of a student who has gotten a bad grade. When faced with this negative outcome or this potential setback, how does the student persist? How do they deal with this, right? One strategy is to be able to change the behavior to avoid these future negative outcomes. And it's certainly appropriate when people experience control over their environments. So in the lab, the way we have tested this is with a task we like to call the persistence with goal task, persistence after setbacks task that was developed by Jamil Banju. And what Jamil did here is sort of a game of life type of task where participants have this initial goal choice. They choose a program of study, pick one of the options, A, B, or C. A leads to a better career / monetary benefits for the future. B and C would lead to less monetary incentives, but perhaps there's maybe an easier kind of path to get to that goal, right? So participants would receive cues as they choose a path. So for example, midterm exam, press the correct key to pass. They'd have to press one of the correct keys in the keyboard or in the response unit in the fMRI. We call this a controllable setback because participants would perceive that they have the control. If they press the correct key, they can pass the exam. And then they will receive positive feedback that they pressed it. Or in this task, we gave a lot of negative outcomes. So in this case, they failed the exam. They have to go back and start over. And one of the measures that we're really interested in is what happens here. Do they persist and they stick to A path, or do they switch and they go to the B path or the C path that are perceived to be easier, but you get less incentives, right? Right, so one other aspect of this task that was important is that every now and then, you also had setbacks like this one. Your course was cut. Press any key to see if your course is cut. We would call this an uncontrollable setback. Essentially, you're making a button response for motor controls, but it's not perceived as any controllable outcome. It's like the computer's control. You get you get a negative outcome in the same way, and we want to see what happens after an uncontrollable negative outcome that's viewed as uncontrollable. Do you persist if you go, or do you switch? Well, it turns out that participants are more likely to persist with their goals after negative outcomes if they view that their failure was a controllable type of trial. That is, they can make a change. They can actually control the outcome for the next trial. And this tends to be dependent when we look at this activity to the outcomes, to the striatum in the controllable outcome. We see a correlation between striatal activity to negative outcomes and choices to persist in the next trial. But in order to persist while they don't persist as much in the uncontrollable trials, in order to persist, what we see it for the uncontrollable trials is actually more ventral medial prefrontal cortex is necessary in order to actually persist in the next trial. Okay, so Jamil followed this up by asking the question, well, what happens during acute stress? That is, when participants are exposed to acute stress. Are they able to persist with their goals under these conditions? So what we did is a socially evaluated cold pressure test where participants put their hands in a bucket of cold water for about 2 minutes while there's a video camera that's taping their reactions. We measure skin conductance responses and salivatory cortisol as a measure of stress. And then we have participants, after they have experienced the stress response, perform the persistence task that I just described to you. So we can measure the effects of stress on this behavioral measures of persistence. We observe that acute stress elevates physiological markers of stress. Here is the skin conductance response during the stress exposure, which is higher for the stress condition compared to the no stress control condition, where they put their hands in a bucket of regular water, room temperature water with no camera. And if we look at the salivatory cortisol, we can see that at baseline levels, they are pretty equivalent. The red line here, which is the stress group, tends to rise and then slowly come back down baseline. And importantly, in the green over here, this is when they perform the persistence task. You can see that the cortisol was elevated, suggesting that participants were under the influence of stress. Okay, so what happens to the task, performance, the behavior in this experiment? So first, I'm going to show you the no stress group. This is the control group. And we can see a replication of the first study, the MRI study I showed you before, which is that participants tend to persist with their goals more in the controllable condition compared to the uncontrollable condition. In the stress condition, what we observe is that stress tends to diminish persistence in the uncontrollable condition. However, the controllable condition, the controllable condition seems to diminish the effects of stress on setbacks, suggesting to us that while the acute stressor reduced persistence when setbacks were uncontrollable, persistence was preserved when setbacks were controllable. So another way that we've been starting to look at how perceived control can be protective is looking at repeated exposure to stressors, and specifically the learned helplessness effect. So here there's a lack of controllability over aversive stimulus, tends to induce behavior passivity, anxiety, and learning deficits. Presence of controllability tends to protect against the negative emotions and behavior passivity induced by external stressors. And there's an important role for the medial prefrontal cortex. We know that activation of rodent MPFC tends to diminish behavior passivity in the face of inescapable shock. And if you inactivate the medial prefrontal cortex, of course, you're going to lead to a lot of behavior passivity. So this was work that was done by Sally Wang. And what she did here is she exposed participants to an aversive stimulus. It was an aversive sound. It's a tone that was really not pleasant. Participants did not care for it. And they had a chance to avoid hearing it. Specifically, they could either avoid it, which would be the red button, or they can give up, which would be the yellow button, right? So if they see the cue, they could make that decision. If they avoid it correctly, they would not hear the tone. If they avoid it incorrectly, they would hear the tone for about 4 seconds. But if they wanted to give up, they would only hear the tone for about 2 seconds. So the interesting question for us here was, are they going to persist and try to keep avoiding it to get it right? Or at some point, are they just going to give up, feel like it's an uncontrollable experience, and they just want to get less of the aversive stimulus? So to do this experiment, we had participants first be exposed to the stimulus here, where they would press the choices, but they were kind of just hearing it and not being able to actually avoid it that much. Then you had the uncontrollable phase where they, under the impression they could avoid it, but they really could not avoid it. And then the controllable phase, where the ability to avoid was restored, and we wanted to measure how much they engaged in actually pressing the button and trying to avoid the stimulus. What I'm showing you here is the proportion of avoidance presses on the y-axis and the different phases that I just covered for you on the x-axis. So the first one is the early aversive exposure, when they're first seeing what the hearing the noise for the first time. And you can see that they are trying to avoid that noise in the beginning. But by late aversive exposure, around the second block or so, they're already starting to not press as much. So that when they get to the uncontrollable situation where they really can't avoid it at all, essentially they almost stop giving, they give up much more than they avoid. Interestingly, in the controllable context, what we see is we see a restoring of the avoidance presses. So participants are trying to restore that, avoid that behavior passivity. And what we observed is that ventromedial prefrontal cortex that was involved in tracking subjective value of control is also associated with increased avoidance in this controllable context. That is, the greater the change in the avoidable attempts during the controllable compared to the uncontrollable condition, the greater the activity in the VMPFC, suggesting that perception of control can diminish behavior passivity and provide a protective effect that's associated with VMPFC activation. Okay, so for this third part, I hope I was able to show you that the perception of control tends to enhance decisions to persist following negative outcomes, that it buffers against effects of stress on decisions to persist following negative outcomes, and that perception of control can diminish behavior passivity, which tends to be a protective effect that's associated with ventromedial prefrontal cortex activity. All right. So I wanted to conclude by giving you just a couple of quick views of where we're really interested in the idea of controls in the future, right? And let's keep focusing on this idea of the reward-related circuitry and how it can be important for the effective signal in terms of leading to protective and motivational factors. So one of the interesting directions that we have is an idea of trying to capitalize on what we call positive emotion-focused coping. Essentially taking control of the negative past by active coping, or in the case I'm going to show you now, positive meaning finding, which tends to help be more protective. So this was work that was led by Megan Spear in collaboration with Daniela Schiller, who's at Mount Sinai. And what we did here is we took advantage of the fact that memory tends to be reconstructed at retrieval, and that once memories are reactivated during retrieval, this memory can be prone to modification and can be updated with new content. So the question we had is whether finding positive meaning in the negative past changes how we feel and helps update what we remember. So we're back to the student who maybe got a bad grade, and this is a memory that elicits negative emotions, negative affect. What we have is we have participants come to the lab, tell us about that memory, and then we ask them to kind of take control a little bit and focus on what's the bright side. Is there something positive that happened because of that? And maybe they'll tell us something to the extent of, I guess I learned to study a little better, or I talked to the professor, made me feel better, and I engaged more in the class, and so on and so forth. Well, the hope is that by doing this, focus on positive aspects of finding positive meaning in things, then the next time they recall this negative memory, it's an updated memory that now integrates the positive content and therefore leads to less negative emotional reactions. So we have participants come into the lab and do this in a session where they gave us, for example, 12 negative memories. They wrote the description, gave us the emotional ratings of how it made them feel, from extremely bad to extremely good. Then they elaborated on that memory, thought about something that may be positive that occurred because of this. Again, found that silver lining or such. But we also had a control group that instead of focusing on the negative, they also just did a natural recall situation. They just kind of focused on the memory, and that's what it was. A week later, we brought them back, and they had to recall those memories again. They would write the descriptions and give us the emotional ratings. And we compared what happens to the memories the first session compared to the second session. Both the updated memories and then the control memories that were not updated. And what I'm showing you here is behavior findings that show that there was a positive feeling change. In the green is the positive group, in the purple is the control group. And across retrievals, across session 1 and session 2, the rate of emotion tends to increase for the positive group. And the content change, that is what they write in the memories, there's more positive words, it's less negative, that also tends to increase in the positive group. And interestingly enough, we bring them back 2 months later, and that effect's still there. People are still having greater incentive in the positive group and the positive change. Okay. So does finding positive meaning in the negative past change how we feel and update what we remember? The answer is yes. There is enhanced positive emotion during future recall, greater positive content in memory recall. This effect lasts up to 2 months. And I didn't get a chance to show you this for time constraints, but I'm happy to talk about it if you're interested. When we do this in the scanner, it also tends to involve not only these reward-related regions such as the ventral striatum, but the hippocampus as well. Okay, the other future direction that we're kind of excited about is this idea of thinking about social factors. Social rewards and social connection is a big topic in the lab, and one that we're starting to integrate and think more about it in the context of control. Specifically, we've been thinking a lot about how social feedback from others, tends to shape perceived control and affect that motivational aspect of perceived control. So this is work from Yuyan Yang again, and this is in prep. She's been thinking about how we can modulate perceived control via social feedback. You might recall what I told you about in terms of that self-efficacy game, the bar game, where you have to hit the bar in the target. I'm not very good at it, as you can see. Well, participants have to play this game for a little while, and they played under 3 conditions. They would play under a positive social feedback condition where they would get encouragement, like you hit it, you're on a roll, or neutral, you hit the target, or discouragement, you hit it, but there's a long way to go. Right. So, and then we'd ask the question after you got the feedback, how well do you think you will do in the next few rounds? This is to assess the effect of the feedback on your performance. And we could see here from the data that positive feedback tended to increase their self-efficacy belief, their perception of control in this condition more so than in the other 2 conditions. Interestingly enough, if we also measured the distance of the bar to hitting the target, right? How far are you from the target? We could see that early on there is no difference in the across the 3 conditions, but that by the end of the experiment, there's an aspect of learning that in the positive condition, people get the distance to the target actually improves, showing that this motivational aspect of social feedback really improved not only the perception of control, but also affecting performance. So positive social feedback here tends to reinforce self-efficacy and improve performance. All right, so just to wrap up here, we're able to talk about this idea of the neural systems of reward being involved in perception of control. The value of control, the opportunity for choice tends to be desirable and recruit these neural systems involved in reward. The subjective value of perceived control tends to be tracked by areas such as the ventral prefrontal cortex. And perceived control has a tremendous benefit that allows us to help cope with negative affect and decisions to persist. Taken together, characterizing the value of exercising control in the brain can help us provide the foundation for understanding how the presence or absence of choice and influence one's ability to cope with negative affect and maladaptive behavior. And I want to end by really thanking everybody who in the lab who really did this work. Specifically, I have here in bolded folks that the work I've talked to about today, former members of the lab, such as Megan Spear, Lauren Liati, Sally Wang, Karan Jamil Banji, Yen Yang, and collaborators such as Liana Romanyuk and Daniela Schiller. And thank you again for the invitation and your attention today.